The man knocked on my door at exactly 7:16 p.m. I almost didn't answer. It had been raining all evening, and I wasn't expecting anyone. Not anymore. Not since Daniel died. But something about the knock felt deliberate. Patient. Like the person outside already knew this house. When I opened the door, I saw a man in his 30s standing under the porch light, soaked from the rain. He looked exhausted. Nervous. And strangely familiar. For a second, I thought grief was playing tricks on me again. Then he spoke. "My name is Evan," he said quietly. "I think my father was your partner." My chest tightened instantly. The world didn't stop dramatically. It tilted. Just enough to make everything unstable. I'm Sharon Wells. I'm 65 years old, and 1 year after burying the man I loved for almost 2 decades, a stranger appeared at my door claiming Daniel had another family. I stared at him in silence. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the porch. "I think there's been a mistake," I finally said. But even as I said it, something inside me already felt afraid. Because the stranger had Daniel's eyes. Not similar. Not close. The same. Evan reached slowly into his jacket pocket. "I didn't come here for money," he said quickly, almost like he expected the accusation. "I just needed answers." Then he handed me an old photograph. And the moment I saw Daniel standing beside a much younger woman holding a child, I felt the grief I spent a year surviving suddenly become something else entirely. I invited him inside before I fully understood why. Maybe because it was raining. Maybe because grief makes people reckless. Or maybe because some part of me already knew this conversation would change everything. Evan stood awkwardly in the entryway while I made tea neither of us touched. The photograph stayed on the table between us. I kept looking at it. Searching for proof it was fake. Edited. Manipulated. Misunderstood. But it wasn't. It was Daniel. You can spend 20 years loving someone and still recognize the smallest details instantly. The way he tilted his head when smiling. The watch he wore almost every day. The jacket I bought him on our anniversary. All of it real. When was this taken? I finally asked. Evan looked down. I think I was about 4. 4. I did the math automatically. 2 automatically. Because Daniel and I had already been together then. A cold feeling moved through my stomach. You're saying he had another relationship while we were together? Evan hesitated immediately. And that hesitation mattered. Because it didn't feel manipulative. It felt careful. I don't actually know, he admitted quietly. My mother died 6 months ago. Before she passed, she told me Daniel was my father. The room suddenly felt smaller. She never contacted him? I asked. She said he disappeared before I was born. I stared at him. Then back at the photograph. Nothing made sense. Daniel wasn't perfect. But disappearing? That didn't fit the man I buried. And then Evan said something that unsettled me even more. She also told me he never knew I existed. That night, after Evan left, I couldn't sleep. The house felt unfamiliar again. Not physically. Emotionally. Like someone had quietly moved the walls while I wasn't looking. I sat in the living room with the old photograph in my lap, staring at Daniel's face for hours. Looking for guilt. For deception. for some hidden version of him I had somehow missed for 20 years. But grief does strange things to memory. The more I searched, the more uncertain I became. Because suddenly, little moments I had buried started resurfacing. Small absences. Phone calls he used to take outside. Trips he explained too quickly. Not enough to accuse someone, but enough to disturb the silence I had built around his memory. At 2 a.m., I found myself opening boxes I hadn't touched since the funeral. Old paperwork. Receipts. Documents. Photographs. I told myself I was searching for answers. But really, I think I was searching for permission to still trust him. And then I found something strange. An envelope. No stamp. No address. Just Daniel's handwriting. I froze immediately, because I recognized the date written in the corner. It was from 17 years ago, the year Evan would have been a teenager. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Only 3 sentences. If this is true, I need time to understand it. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Please don't contact Sharon until I know what to do. I stopped breathing for a second. The room became painfully quiet. Because now I knew one thing for certain. Daniel had known. Maybe not from the beginning. But at some point he knew. The next morning, I almost called Evan and told him never to contact me again. Part of me wanted to protect what remained of Daniel. Not the man himself. The memory of him. Because grief is complicated that way. Sometimes losing the illusion hurts more than losing the person. But instead, I invited Evan back. If my life was about to unravel, I needed the full truth. Not fragments. Not assumptions. When he arrived, I placed the letter carefully on the kitchen table between us. His face changed the second he saw Daniel's handwriting. "You found this?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Evan didn't touch the paper immediately. Like he was afraid it might confirm something he'd spent his entire life trying not to believe. "He knew," I said softly. The words tasted bitter. Evan stared at the letter for a long time before answering. "Maybe," he whispered. "Maybe." That word unsettled me. "What does that mean?" I asked. Evan leaned back slowly. "My mother lied sometimes," he admitted carefully. "Not about important things, but about painful ones." I frowned. She told different versions of the story depending on when you asked. A strange feeling crept into my chest. What kind of different versions? He hesitated. Then finally answered. "Sometimes," she said, "Daniel abandoned us." Silence. "And other times?" Evan looked down. She said she never told him. I felt my stomach drop. Because suddenly the entire story shifted again. Not into clarity. Into uncertainty. And uncertainty was somehow worse. "Do you think she made this up?" I asked carefully. Evan shook his head immediately. "No," he said. "I think she was scared." He paused. Scared enough to change the truth depending on what hurt less that day. I looked again at Daniel's letter. And for the first time since Evan appeared at my door, I stopped asking whether Daniel had betrayed me. And started asking something far more dangerous. How much of anyone's memory can we actually trust after they're gone? Over the next few days, Evan and I did something neither of us expected. We started talking about Daniel like two people trying to assemble the same puzzle from different boxes. At first, it felt uncomfortable, almost disloyal, because every memory one of us shared seemed to threaten the other. But slowly, something stranger happened. The stories began overlapping. Not romantically. Not secretly. Just humanly. Evan remembered Daniel teaching him how to hold a fishing rod when he was little. I remembered Daniel disappearing one Saturday every month for volunteer work near the lake outside town. Evan remembered receiving birthday gifts with no return address for years. I remembered Daniel insisting we donate anonymously to children's charities every December. None of it proved innocence. But none of it matched the image of a selfish man abandoning a hidden child either. And that contradiction started haunting me. One afternoon, Evan showed me an old voicemail saved on his phone. I almost deleted it after Mom died, he admitted. The recording crackled softly when he pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room instantly. Older. Gentler. Careful. Hey, it's Daniel. I got your message. I think we need to talk in person this time. I should have handled this years ago. My chest tightened painfully. I'm not trying to disappear, the recording continued quietly. I just don't know how to explain any of this without hurting people. The message ended there. No context. No answer. Just uncertainty. But it changed something important inside me. Because liars usually protect themselves first. And Daniel sounded like a man trying, and failing, to protect everyone at once. Evan looked away. He left that 3 months before he died, he said quietly. 3 months. Daniel had carried this secret until the end of his life. And suddenly I realized something horrifying. Maybe he wasn't hiding another family. Maybe he was trying to hold together two broken versions of the truth at the same time. A week later, I found myself driving somewhere I never thought I would go. Daniel's old storage unit. I almost turned around twice. Because part of me still feared what I might find. A second life. Hidden accounts. Photographs proving everything I didn't want to believe. But another part of me needed certainty more than comfort. The manager handed me the key without asking questions. Apparently Daniel had kept the unit for over 15 years. 15. That number alone made my stomach twist. What could someone hide for that long? Evan came with me but stayed unusually quiet. When the metal door rolled open, dust drifted into the cold air. Boxes. Furniture. Old camping equipment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looked like evidence of betrayal. At first. Then I noticed a smaller locked chest near the back wall. Evan saw it too. My pulse instantly sped up. Because hidden things always feel dangerous. We opened it together. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Carefully bundled with rubber bands. Most were addressed to Daniel. Some from Evan's mother. Others never sent at all. I opened one slowly. And the first sentence made my chest ache immediately. You deserve to know about him, but I'm terrified you'll take him away. I looked up at Evan. Neither of us spoke. I opened another. I saw you with Sharon today. She looked happy. I couldn't ruin that. Another. He asked about you again. Another. I think he has your smile. My eyes blurred suddenly. Not from anger. From grief becoming something more complicated than grief. Because every letter revealed the same terrible truth. Daniel had never fully left. And Evan had never fully been allowed in. We spent nearly 3 hours inside that storage unit. Neither of us wanted to leave first. Because every new letter changed the story again. Not into something cleaner. Into something sadder. More human. One letter had never been opened at all. Still sealed. Daniel's name written across the front in handwriting that looked rushed and uneven. Evan stared at it silently. She must have mailed it after they stopped speaking, he whispered. For some reason, that hurt the most. Not betrayal. Timing. Missed chances. Lives almost connected. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single page. Short. I'm tired of raising him alone while pretending you don't exist. I stopped there for a second. My chest tightened immediately. But then the next line changed everything. I know you're trying in your own broken way, but he deserves more than secret visits and hidden gifts. Secret visits. Evan looked stunned. What? I asked softly. He shook his head slowly. I thought the fishing trips were random, he whispered. My stomach dropped. Wait, you met him more than once? Evan laughed bitterly under his breath. I didn't know I was meeting my father. Silence filled the storage unit. Cold. Heavy. He introduced himself as a family friend. Evan continued quietly. Mum always acted strange afterward, but I never understood why. I sat down slowly on one of the dusty boxes because my legs suddenly felt weak. Because now I understood the real tragedy. Daniel hadn't abandoned a secret child. And he hadn't lived a glamorous double life. He had spent years trapped between guilt, fear, loyalty, and cowardice. Trying to stay connected without destroying the life he already had. And failing everyone a little in the process. Including himself. Evan sat across from me, staring at another letter in silence. You know what's messed up? He asked finally. I looked at him. I wanted to hate him my whole life, he said quietly. But the more I learn, the harder that gets. And somehow that hurt even more than anger would have. That night, after the storage unit, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Daniel had loved us both. Differently. Imperfectly. Secretly. But genuinely. And somehow that realization made the grief sharper instead of softer. Because now I wasn't mourning one loss. I was mourning two lives that never fully got to exist together. The next morning, Evan called me unexpectedly. I found something else, he said quietly. An hour later, he arrived carrying a small worn notebook. Daniel's journal. Or at least part of one. I found it hidden inside one of the boxes, Evan explained. My pulse instantly quickened. Part of me didn't want to open it. Because journals contain the version of people they never say out loud. And I wasn't sure I could survive another version of Daniel. Still, I opened it carefully. Most entries were short. Dates. Thoughts. Fragments. But one page stopped me immediately. I saw him smile today. Same crooked smile I had at that age. I wanted to tell him the truth. But Sharon looked at me tonight like I was her entire world. And I couldn't destroy either life. My vision blurred. I turned the page. Another entry. He asked if I'd come fishing again next month. I said yes before thinking. I don't know what kind of man that makes me anymore. I pressed my hand against my mouth. Because for the first time, I could hear Daniel's guilt directly. Not as a secret. Not as suspicion. As pain. Evan sat quietly across from me. Then asked the question neither of us wanted to say out loud. Do you think he loved us equally? The room went silent again. I looked down at the journal. At the shaky handwriting. At the years of confusion trapped between the lines. And I realized something heartbreaking. Love doesn't always make people brave. Sometimes it makes them weak. For the next few weeks, Evan became part of my life in a way neither of us expected. Not suddenly. Not comfortably. Carefully. Like two strangers walking through the ruins of the same person. At first, we only met to go through Daniel's things. Old photographs. Receipts. Letters. Half-finished notes. But eventually, we started talking about other things too. Childhood memories. Music. The ridiculous way Daniel overcooked eggs every Sunday morning. And every small similarity between them felt like another quiet shock. The same laugh. The same habit of rubbing their forehead when stressed. Even the same terrible sense of direction. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the garage, Evan suddenly froze. What is it? I asked. He held up an old photograph carefully. Daniel was standing beside me at a Christmas party 15 years ago. I remembered the night instantly. But Evan was staring at the background. At himself. A teenage boy standing near the buffet table. My breath caught. Oh my God, I whispered. Evan looked pale. I was there, he said quietly. And suddenly the room felt too small again. Because Daniel had somehow kept both worlds dangerously close without either of us realizing it. I took the photograph from his hands slowly. My mind replayed the night differently now. Daniel disappearing for almost an hour. Returning tense. Distracted. I remembered asking if everything was okay. And I remembered his exact answer. Just saw someone from the past. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. Evan sat down heavily on the floor. I spent my entire life closer to him than I realized, he said softly. His voice broke slightly. And he still couldn't tell me. I didn't know what to say. Because there was no comforting answer left. Only grief changing shape again. And for the first time since all this began, I became angry at Daniel. Not for loving someone else. But for waiting too long to choose honesty. A month after Evan first appeared at my door, we visited Daniel's grave together. Neither of us suggested it directly. It just happened. The cemetery was quiet except for wind moving through the trees. I hadn't been there in weeks. Partly because grief exhausted me. And partly because I no longer knew which version of Daniel I was mourning. The loyal partner? The frightened father? The man divided between two unfinished lives? Evan stood beside me silently for a long time. Then he laughed softly under his breath. What? I asked. He shook his head. It's weird, he admitted. I spent years imagining what I'd say if I ever met him. His eyes stayed on the gravestone. And now I'm standing here talking to a name. That sentence nearly broke me. Because underneath all the secrets and confusion was something painfully simple. Two people had lost the same man in completely different ways. I used to think closure was getting answers, Evan said quietly. I looked at him. But honestly, I think closure is realizing nobody really wins in stories like this. The wind moved through the cemetery again. Cold. Quiet. Honest. I stared at Daniel's name carved into stone. And suddenly I stopped seeing him as either hero or villain. He was just human. Flawed. Afraid. Loving. Weak. A man who kept postponing truth until there was no time left to tell it. And somehow that realization hurt more than betrayal ever could. Before leaving, Evan crouched down near the grave. I don't hate you anymore, he said softly. My throat tightened instantly. Because I realized something at the exact same moment. Neither did I. After the cemetery, something between Evan and me changed again. The tension faded. Not completely. But enough for grief to stop feeling like a battlefield. We started having dinner together once a week. At first, it felt awkward. Two people connected by someone who was no longer there to explain himself. But slowly, the conversations became easier. Lighter. Sometimes we even laughed. And every time we did, I felt guilty for half a second before realizing something important. Healing sounds disrespectful when you first survive heartbreak. One evening, Evan brought an old box I hadn't seen before. My mother kept this hidden, he said quietly. Inside were drawings. Dozens of them. Childish sketches in crayon. Fishing boats. Trees. Stick figures. And in nearly every drawing, there was a tall man beside a little boy. Daniel. I felt tears rise immediately. Because no matter how complicated the truth became, a child had loved him completely. Evan picked up one drawing carefully. I used to wait near the window after those fishing trips, he admitted softly. I thought maybe he'd come back. The room became painfully quiet. And he never did? I asked. Evan smiled sadly. Not the way I wanted. That sentence stayed with me. Because suddenly I understood Daniel's greatest mistake. It wasn't loving two people. It was believing partial love could protect everyone from pain. But hidden love still leaves scars. Sometimes deeper ones. Evan looked at me across the table. You know what's strange? He asked. What? You were the person I thought I'd hate the most. I blinked in surprise. Why? Because you had the life with him that I didn't. The honesty of it hurt. But then he smiled faintly. And now you're the only person who actually understands what losing him felt like. I looked down for a moment, overwhelmed by the strange shape life had taken. Then I realized something. Daniel left behind secrets. But somehow, in the middle of all the damage, he also left behind family. 3 months later, Daniel's lawyer finally called. I had almost forgotten about the estate by then. Not because it wasn't important, but because grief had changed shape again. The inheritance no longer felt like money. It felt like the final unfinished conversation Daniel never got to have. Evan came with me to the lawyer's office. Neither of us said much in the elevator. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. Just heavy with history. The lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable the moment he saw us together. Which immediately told me one thing. Daniel had planned for this possibility. There's something Mr. Harper left instructions for, the lawyer said carefully. My pulse quickened. He opened a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. For both of us. My hands trembled before I even unfolded it. If you're reading this together, it began, then I ran out of time. The room disappeared around me. I spent years convincing myself that protecting people and lying to them were the same thing. They aren't. I closed my eyes briefly. Because even after death, Daniel still knew exactly where the wound was. The letter continued. To Sharon. You gave me the happiest years of my life. To Evan. I thought distance would hurt you less than the truth. I was wrong about both. Evan looked down immediately. I could see his jaw tighten. And then came the part none of us expected. Daniel had divided the inheritance equally between us. Not out of guilt. Out of acknowledgement. The letter explained everything simply. You were both my family, even when I lacked the courage to let those worlds meet. I started crying before I realized I was crying. Not because of the money. Because after years of secrets, Daniel had finally said the one thing he should have said while alive. The truth. Complete. Painful. Late. But real. Before leaving, the lawyer handed Evan one final item. An old silver watch. Daniel's watch. The one he wore almost every day. Evan stared at it silently. Then looked at me. You should keep it, he whispered. I shook my head gently. No, I said softly. I think he wanted you to have time with him too. And for the first time since all this began, the grief between us no longer felt divided. 6 months later, Evan came to my house for Sunday dinner. By then, it no longer felt unusual. He brought wine. I overcooked the potatoes. And halfway through the evening, we both laughed because Daniel used to complain about that exact thing every single time. The grief was still there. I think it always will be. But it no longer sat in the center of the room controlling everything. It had softened into memory. Complicated memory. The kind that hurts and comforts you at the same time. After dinner, Evan helped me clean the kitchen. At one point, he paused while drying a plate. You know, he said quietly, for a long time I thought finding him would fix something in me. I looked at him carefully. And did it? He smiled sadly. No. But finding you did. That nearly broke me again. Because life is strange that way. Sometimes people enter your world carrying pain, and somehow leave behind connection instead. Later that night, after Evan left, I sat alone on the back porch. The air was cool. The neighborhood quiet. And for the first time in over a year, I spoke to Daniel out loud without anger. You really made a mess of things, I whispered. I almost laughed through the tears. Because it was true. He had. But he also loved deeply. Imperfectly. Fearfully. Humanly. And maybe that was the hardest truth of all. Not that he lived a double life. But that one person can hold love, weakness, guilt, and kindness all at the same time. I used to think grief was learning how to let someone go. Now I think it's learning how to carry them differently. Not as an ideal. Not as a wound. But as a real person. The wind moved softly through the trees. And somewhere inside that quiet moment, life finally kept moving forward. So did we.